The restaurant was buzzing with the usual lunchtime chatter, the kind that masks everything underneath. I sat at the head of the long table, smiling as my family trickled in, each greeting more perfunctory than heartfelt. My daughter slipped in last, cheeks flushed, a strange glimmer in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. I caught the way she exchanged a glance with my nephew, the kind of glance that spoke louder than words. Something was off. My wife's favorite cousin hovered too close to my son, laughing a little too sharply at a joke that wasn't funny. And my sister, she couldn't meet my eyes without darting them toward the purse I had set on the chair next to me, the one she always considered out of reach. I forced a casual sip of my water, letting it wash over me, though my instincts screamed that this lunch was more than it appeared. Every small gesture, the brush of hands, the lingering looks, told a story of quiet scheming, favoritism, and unspoken resentments. I knew enough to watch, to wait, to let them reveal themselves. Even in their smiles and polite chatter, I could sense the tension crackling, an undercurrent of something waiting to happen. And as the waiter placed the first course in front of me, I realized that today, nothing would be normal, and I had to be ready for every move they thought I wouldn't notice. I watched my daughter closely, pretending to focus on the menu as she whispered something to my nephew. Their heads bent together, lips moving in a conspiratorial dance, and I caught the faint smirk she tried to hide. My mind immediately went to all the times she had pushed boundaries, small betrayals that had left me wondering if she ever really respected me. This wasn't new, but something about the timing, the precision of her glances, told me this was deliberate, calculated. I remembered the Christmas when she had accidentally spilled red wine on my new jacket, the Easter where she had manipulated my sister into siding against me, even the summer trip when my trust had been tested by her minor lies that cost me hours of stress. Each incident seemed insignificant at the time, but looking back, a pattern emerged. She had always tested the limits, watched for my weaknesses, and tried to exploit them. I sipped my tea slowly, letting my calm demeanor mask the sharp assessment in my mind. I knew exactly what she was doing, and I knew I had the upper hand if I chose to act. The tension twisted tighter in my chest as I realized that this lunch was no longer about celebration. It was a stage for her subtle games. I had been patient before, but I wasn't blind, and today, the scales were quietly tipping in my favor. I froze for a fraction of a second when I caught her whisper, barely audible over the clatter of cutlery. "While I distract him?" My stomach tightened, but my face remained serene, a mask of casual interest as I pretended to examine my plate. Inside, every neuron was alert, calculating. I knew exactly what she intended, and I was already 3 steps ahead. My mind drifted briefly to the countless small betrayals that had brought me here, the subtle ways my family had tried to diminish me. There was the inheritance meeting where my suggestions were ignored, while my cousin's opinions were elevated. The dinner where my achievements were brushed aside, and the charity gala where my ideas were quietly appropriated. Each moment had stung, a reminder of my perceived insignificance, but also a lesson in patience and observation. I had always been underestimated, written off as mild or distracted, and yet here I was, fully aware of every underhanded maneuver around me. The daughter's whisper was a spark, but I had an entire arsenal of awareness and foresight. My pulse slowed, measured, as I let the moment settle. She thought she could manipulate the scene, but she didn't realize she was dealing with someone who had learned to anticipate every move, a person who had turned being undervalued into a quiet power. Today, her attempt at control would meet my calm precision, and the table, so full of hidden tension and whispered schemes, would be the setting where the balance began to shift. "Happy birthday, Dad," my sister said, her smile tight, eyes flicking past me as if searching for something more important. I nodded, returning the greeting without enthusiasm, feeling the familiar sting of being overlooked. "Did you see the photos from last weekend?" my cousin asked, leaning in toward my son, bypassing me entirely. I forced a chuckle, catching the subtle glance my daughter shot me, half apologetic, half conspiratorial. "No, I must have missed them," I said, letting my voice remain light, but every word was carefully measured. I remembered how, in the past, my opinions were dismissed at family gatherings, my contributions unnoticed, and my suggestions quietly overruled. Even now, as my mother praised my cousin's career achievements while barely acknowledging mine, I felt the old frustration simmer. Yet beneath the irritation, a quiet sense of control was building. Every slight, every favoritism-laden comment fed into a mental ledger I had been keeping for years. I listened, observed, and stored, each word and glance another piece in the puzzle I was beginning to assemble. The power of patience, I realized, lay in subtlety. They thought they were dominating the conversation, but I was quietly mapping every move. By the time dessert arrived, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, a controlled energy that promised not just observation, but eventual reversal. Their underestimation was my leverage, and for the first time that afternoon, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to curve my lips. By the time the main course arrived, it was clear that the daughter's plan had moved from whisper to action. She leaned slightly toward my nephew, dropping casual comments that painted me as forgetful, distracted, even incompetent. "He probably won't even notice if this goes missing," she murmured, her tone loud enough for nearby ears, but low enough to make me lean in. The waitress's tray of drinks wobbled slightly as if on cue, and my daughter's eyes darted toward me, gauging my reaction. I kept my expression neutral, nodding as though I had not heard her, though internally I catalogued every word, every glance, every shift in posture. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was calculated, a test to see how far she could push without consequence. I remembered all the small humiliations she had orchestrated before. Hiding my phone at the charity event, misdirecting guests at last year's birthday, and arranging minor embarrassments that left me fuming silently. But this time I wasn't merely observing. I was planning. I traced the lines of her strategy in my mind, anticipating her moves like a chessboard, imagining how each small action could be turned back on her. The tension between us was palpable, a charged wire in the air. Every glance and whispered word heightened the suspense, making the lunch feel less like a celebration and more like a stage set for a quiet showdown. They thought they were in control, but I knew the climax was approaching, and soon, every subtle scheme would meet its counter. I waited, letting the moment stretch just long enough for them to believe their scheme was working. When my daughter reached for the centerpiece, intending to discreetly spill a drink onto my plate, I shifted my hand ever so slightly, catching the glass with a calm, almost effortless motion. Her eyes widened for the briefest moment, a flicker of panic that no one else noticed. I smiled softly, pretending to examine my fork, as if nothing had happened, while internally savoring the tiny victory. I could hear my nephew stifle a laugh, sensing the subtle tension. But none of the adults around the table had the slightest clue. The whispers and exchanged glances, meant to intimidate me, now revealed themselves like open cards. I let a casual comment slip about how careful we had to be with the wine, drawing attention to the daughter's clumsiness without ever saying her name. The shift was quiet, imperceptible to anyone not paying attention, yet the balance had already started tipping. Years of being underestimated had trained me to notice the invisible cues, the small miscalculations of those who thought they could manipulate me. I felt a surge of quiet empowerment, knowing I had turned their own plan against them before it could even land. In that instant, the room's tension transformed subtly. They believed they had control, while I had already claimed it in ways they could not see. Their underestimation was my weapon, and the thrill of that silent triumph coursed through me as the lunch continued, each course now a proving ground for the next reversal. As I lifted my glass, I let my mind wander to the months, even years, of preparation that had brought me here. No one at this table realized how much I had quietly built while they laughed, dismissed, or ignored me. There were investments made discreetly, stakes in businesses they assumed were beyond my reach, legal arrangements that ensured I held the upper hand in family assets, and connections cultivated in circles they would never suspect I frequented. Every minor humiliation, every favor asked and denied, had been noted, catalogued, and transformed into leverage. I remembered how I had quietly funded my son's education, secured opportunities for my daughter, and maneuvered through social networks that provided subtle influence, all while appearing unremarkable. These hidden preparations had been my shield and my sword, my silent rebellion against years of underestimation. I smiled inwardly, knowing that today all of it could tip the scales. Each glance, each whispered scheme around the table only served to highlight their ignorance. and the tension in the room thickened with the weight of unspoken potential. They thought they had me cornered, but I had already laid the groundwork to reclaim control, and the power they so casually assumed I lacked was quietly, inexorably rising. Every past slight and subtle betrayal now fueled my resolve, reminding me that the quiet, calculating mind often held the loudest victories. I noticed her subtle shift first in the tightening of her jaw, the way her hands fidgeted with the napkin, as if it could somehow steady her nerves. Her whispered comments to my nephew became more frequent, sharper, almost panicked. "Did he see that? He must have noticed," she muttered under her breath, unaware that I could hear every syllable. I pretended to sip my water, calm and collected, letting the tension build like a quiet storm. Inside, I traced the arc of her growing disbelief, relishing the contrast between her frantic energy and my measured control. I remembered all the times I had been underestimated, the dismissive nods, the side conversations, the assumptions that I was powerless, and now the roles had reversed without anyone else realizing. She was unraveling under the weight of her own ambition, while I remained the composed anchor at the head of the table. Every glance she threw in my direction carried frustration, disbelief, and a trace of fear, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power she had failed to anticipate. I let her unravel a little more, allowing her whispered anxieties and furtive glances to play out, each one confirming my quiet dominance. The contrast framed the room like a living portrait, her panic, my calm, her scheming, my foresight, her underestimation, my unshakable control. The audience of one, the daughter, was finally realizing that the game had changed, and I, long dismissed and undervalued, was the one quietly writing the rules. Just as the tension seemed ready to snap, I found the perfect opening. My daughter leaned over to nudge my nephew again, whispering under her breath with the intent of drawing my attention away. I let her think she had succeeded, then spoke casually, my tone light but pointed. "Funny how certain things always seem to get misplaced at my table. I wonder how that keeps happening." The words were innocent enough on the surface, but the implication was clear. Her eyes flicked toward me, a flash of recognition passing through them as the corner of her smirk faltered. I could see her trying to recalculate, the confidence in her plan beginning to crumble. No one else noticed the subtle shift. The casual comment disguised the exposure, but internally, I felt the thrill of control tighten around me like a glove. My mind replayed every small betrayal, every slight she thought would go unnoticed, and I let it guide this gentle, indirect reveal. She froze momentarily, caught between panic and improvisation, and I allowed just enough ambiguity to keep the table guessing. The atmosphere shifted, charged now with anticipation, as if everyone subconsciously sensed that something was about to break. My calm, deliberate maneuver had turned suspicion back toward her, exposing her motives without a single public confrontation. And as I raised my glass to sip, I knew the next move she made could either unravel her completely or set the stage for the larger confrontation I had been waiting for, leaving a cliffhanger tension that hung heavy over the rest of the meal. The moment came almost imperceptibly, yet it hit with the force of a tidal wave. My daughter, confident that her little maneuver would humiliate me in front of everyone, had set her stage, but the irony of her timing became painfully clear, first to her, then to everyone else. As she attempted to subtly draw attention to what she thought was my faux pas, I let a faint chuckle escape, barely audible, and commented casually on the situation, framing it in a way that highlighted her own overreach. Heads turned, laughter rippled, not at me as she had hoped, but at her flustered scramble to explain herself. The words she had whispered to manipulate and embarrass me now hung in the air, twisted by my subtle framing into evidence of her miscalculation. I could see her flush, the slow realization dawning that she had underestimated me entirely. My smile remained calm, controlled, a stark contrast to her panic. Every whispered attempt at control, every furtive glance at my reactions, now worked against her. The room, sensing the shift, began to mirror the reversal. Those who had once overlooked or dismissed me now saw the quiet authority I wielded effortlessly. Status tension, once so heavily in her favor, collapsed, leaving her exposed. The satisfaction was quiet but profound. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, call her out publicly, or make a spectacle. Karma had delivered its reward in the most elegant of ways, and the daughter's social gambit had backfired spectacularly. I felt an intoxicating mixture of vindication and empowerment, as the weight of their assumptions and my own careful preparation aligned perfectly. By the time the dessert menus arrived, the family had shifted in their perception of me. I was no longer the underestimated sideline parent. They saw the power and control I had quietly accumulated, the patience and insight that had allowed this reversal to unfold. Every whispered plan she had thought would succeed was now a testament to her own hubris, and the lesson was clear without a single raised voice or overt confrontation. I sipped my water slowly, letting the moment linger, savoring the subtle yet undeniable triumph that had quietly settled over the table. By the time the main course had been cleared, the subtle currents of tension had grown into a palpable storm. I could see it in their eyes, the realization dawning that nothing here was by chance, that every perceived oversight, every slight, had been part of a calculated pattern they had failed to recognize. My daughter's earlier confidence had crumbled completely. She shifted in her seat, cheeks flushed, hands twisting the napkin, every gesture betraying disbelief. I thought you wouldn't notice, she stammered, voice barely above a whisper, more to herself than anyone else. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate smile, tilting my head slightly as if humoring a small child. Notice? Oh, I noticed, I said evenly, letting the weight of those words settle across the table. The subtle authority in my tone carried far more impact than any loud confrontation could have achieved. My son and nephew exchanged astonished glances, realizing in that instant that I had orchestrated everything with quiet precision, turning their own assumptions into tools of exposure. The room fell into a hush as I recounted, without malice, only clarity, the sequence of small betrayals and manipulations that had unfolded over the years, demonstrating the full scope of my awareness and foresight. My daughter tried to interject, but her voice faltered. Every attempt to regain control only highlighted her miscalculation. Even my sister, usually quick to side with any perceived victim, remained silent, the truth of my competence undeniable. Each family member now understood the reality they had ignored. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and undervalued for years. But today, every quiet observation, every hidden preparation, every moment of patience had culminated in a complete reversal. The subtle social power I wielded had transformed into something unmistakable, an undeniable authority and intelligence that could not be contested. In that charged moment, I felt a wave of empathy for them, oddly mingled with satisfaction. They had acted out of habit, assumptions, and ignorance, and now they were forced to confront the consequences. The climax reached its peak not with shouting or spectacle, but with a quiet, devastating exposure of truth. The daughter's attempt at embarrassment had turned into her own undoing, and the entire family bore witness. In the stillness that followed, I could feel the weight of every past slight, every overlooked effort, crystallize into a triumph that was both moral and social, an elegant closure that validated not only my patience and intelligence, but also the subtle justice of the moment. They would not forget this meal, nor the realization that I had always been several moves ahead, quietly orchestrating the outcome they had so arrogantly assumed was theirs to control. The room slowly settled, the clinking of cutlery and quiet murmurs filling the space like the aftermath of a storm. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of what had just unfolded sink in. Inside, a swirl of emotions coursed through me, satisfaction, relief, and a quiet, almost imperceptible pride. Bittersweet, because while I had achieved the reversal, the fractures in the family were deeper than anyone could mend in a single lunch. I thought of my daughter, her flushed face still tinged with disbelief, and I felt a mix of compassion and firm resolve. This was not about punishment. It was about balance, about showing that underestimation had consequences. I reflected on every calculated step, every quiet observation, and felt empowered by the patience and foresight that had guided me to this point. The dynamics at the table had shifted permanently. Those who once held sway now regarded me with a mix of respect, wariness, and subtle awe, and yet, outwardly I remained calm, measured, composed. My voice, gestures, and demeanor betrayed nothing of the inner triumph, allowing me to hold the quiet authority that had been mine all along. I thought about the lessons woven into the day, the hidden threads of patience, intelligence, and subtle power, and realized that this quiet, calculated victory was more satisfying than any public spectacle could have been. The family would adjust, recalibrate, and perhaps even grow, but the knowledge of what had transpired, the invisible shift of control, the undeniable demonstration of capability, would remain etched in their perception. As I sipped the last of my water, I felt the calm certainty of someone who had endured, observed, and emerged stronger, quietly triumphant in a way that no words could fully capture. As the lunch drew to a close, I let my thoughts drift over everything that had transpired, savoring the calm after the storm. The lesson was clear. Intelligence, patience, and emotional control always outlast impulsive reactions. Every small slight, every whispered plan had been met not with anger but with observation and quiet strategy. I reflected on how years of careful attention, silent preparation, and understanding of human behavior had allowed me to turn the tables without raising my voice or creating a scene. The satisfaction was deep and personal, a quiet validation that came from knowing I had navigated betrayal with grace and precision. For viewers, there was a sense of catharsis in seeing the underestimated succeed, the manipulative humbled, and the subtle power of patience rewarded. The story underscored that true strength often lies in restraint, in turning observation into leverage, and in waiting for the perfect moment to act. By the end, the audience could feel the emotional weight lifted, their own frustrations mirrored and resolved through the protagonist's clever, measured response. The final takeaway lingered. Careful thought, emotional intelligence, and steadfast composure yield rewards far greater than rash confrontation ever could. As I gathered my coat and prepared to leave, I cast one last glance across the table. The subtle shifts in expression, the unspoken acknowledgement of my quiet authority, lingered in the air like a secret only a few could truly understand. I felt a twinge of satisfaction, yes, but also an awareness that family dynamics are never fully settled. There would be more schemes, more whispered plans, more opportunities for them to underestimate me again. But this time, I would be ready, as I had always been. My mind wandered to future gatherings, the small strategic maneuvers I could employ, the lessons hidden in each minor slight that might come my way. I allowed a faint, knowing smile to cross my lips, the kind that promised both patience and ingenuity. The audience, witnessing this, could sense the tension between finality and anticipation. The story had reached a satisfying conclusion, yet the undercurrent hinted at continued cleverness, the potential for future reversals, and the unshakable awareness that I would always stay one step ahead. Even as I stepped into the cool evening air, leaving the restaurant behind, the echoes of power, patience, and quiet triumph followed me, reminding me, and anyone watching, that being underestimated is often the greatest advantage one can hold. The story concluded with a sense of closure, yet the lingering curiosity, the subtleties of ongoing strategy left a small, tantalizing gap for the imagination to fill, ensuring the emotional impact would resonate long after the final word.